propaganda, that only happens in other countries. I remember when I was back in university, I watched these videos on YouTube, and they were claimed to be North Korean propaganda videos. And the videos were in Korean, but there was English subtitles. And while I watched those videos, I kind of agreed with a lot of the descriptions that were being given. The way that they were describing sort of Western culture, like the values, and like the description of it wasn't inaccurate. Like it wasn't like a blatant lie, but it was kind of like being presented in this way that was like, well, like this is bad. Like you don't want this. You don't want to live this way. You can always tell a story from any perspective, right? Like if you're on the outside of something, you can always describe it in a way that is accurate, told in a way that makes it not look good or makes it seem bad. And so like it was really obvious that this was like propaganda because it was being watched by me like as like this uninvolved third party. And so like I could like objectively see what was being said, and I could also look at what it was being said about, and I could agree with it or disagree with it. Propaganda is a communication that is primarily used to influence an audience and further an agenda which may not be objectively true. And so it often involves it uses selected facts and loaded language to create emotional rather than rational responses. So sort of that is what propaganda is. And I think I remember reading as well that it wasn't necessarily that it was evil. It was just like that it was sort of driving or being used to use emotions rather than rationality. And like I think that propaganda happens a lot of times because we're always being asked to use our emotions, asked to think with our sort of our feelings rather than like the rational side of our brains. And this is especially true like in a culture that's sort of driven and perpetuated or driven by fear. And that's often what happens through the media is like we have a fear-based society or we have a fear-based media, which creates like sort of negative, scary stories that make us fearful. And that's sort of engaging us to have like an emotional response to these stories instead of a rational one. And like some sort of common sort of, propaganda terms these days is the made in America, made in Canada, build back better, change you can believe in. Like these are like propaganda sort of emotional rather than rational statement. But they're kind of the goal of them or the objective of them is to sort of make us emotionally respond to these ideas and believe them without necessarily or even being convinced in like a rational way, just like in an emotional way. Another thing too is like we're always like sort of presented with, well, like there's Russian propaganda, there's Chinese propaganda. We're always told that like in these other countries that the people are propagandized all the time. You ever see that like Tiananmen Square picture? Then like you're told, well, like in China they don't know about this picture, they're sort of blinded by propaganda. And then on the other side of it though, like we have like Westerners see these pictures and they're like, well, like this is a really powerful message. It's propaganda for us almost to like see the picture, and it's propaganda for the other people not to see the picture, right? Because depending on how you're seeing it, what context is being presented to you, like it has a different sort of interpretation, it has a different sense of meaning to it. What is propaganda and what is not, it becomes difficult to see. Like in a lot of ways too, like I remember reading that like propaganda wasn't always viewed as a negative thing. It's kind of something that we have like a negative perception of now, but it wasn't always intended to be negative. It was just that the focus on emotions rather than rationality. We're often given the impression that voting and politics and being influenced or it's controlled or it's manipulated in other countries, but like we never kind of think about like those same things happening in our own countries, never reflect or look back and say, well, you know what, maybe these same criticisms that we can make of other countries that we can say other countries are doing is, it's happening here as well. Like we're being influenced, we're being driven to make emotional rather than rational decisions all the time. So much of the stories that were presented, they sort of feed into this idea about our culture, about this like narrative about like that we're maybe the best or that we do things the right way and other people are wrong and they're doing it the wrong way. And like this is just sort of what propaganda is, right? Like it's just about trying to convince us that we're right and other people are wrong. And whether or not that's true, like that's debatable, that's up for debate. That's something that can potentially be answered. As far as like we understand it, like we just assume that we're right and we assume we're doing the right thing. That's sort of the emotional way that it's presented to us. That's the emotional way that we perceive it. That's the emotional way that we understand it. And we kind of forget about the rational way that sort of is lying underneath the surface there. If you look at the rational way, like maybe the story doesn't pile up. Maybe the story doesn't sort of line up and maybe it's just a house of cards. And like maybe the reason why we believe certain things is because we are relying on our emotions rather than the facts and rationality. But I think like the underlying sort of assumption here is that it never happens. There's never propaganda here. There's never these manipulations. There's never this control. We're free, we're more reasonable, we're like enlightened, we do all these things for real legitimate reasons, and there's no reason to ask questions about why we're doing it. Like, we always have this impression about ourselves. We always think that we're in the right, that we're doing things for the right reasons, and we pretend that sort of like things like propaganda, like manipulation, happens in other places, but not where we live, because we always get presented stories in the media about manipulation in other countries and others in other places, but we never like hear about it in our place, because we live here and we believe the stories that we're told, and everything we do happens for like a reason, and it's all rational why it happens the way that it does. And kind of what I'm getting at there is like, when it happens in another country, like it's really easy to say like to rationalize it. Like we can look at the context of where they're living, and we can say, well, like, oh, they don't have a real democracy, like they don't vote, they don't get to go out and be free people, like that. We can always like rationalize why other countries do things. And then we can also at the same time though, like when we are looking at our own sort of lives and our own sort of cultures, then we can say, well, like we do this for that reason and this reason and that reason. And so it's like, it's weird. It's like when we are looking at another country, another way of doing things, we can have this like third eye perspective where we're like objective and rational about it. But like when we look at our own way of doing things, we always like are emotionally driven by it. We're always fixated in our bias and our sort of our way of understanding things, that we never can look objectively at like what we're doing. We can never sort of understand what we're doing and how we're doing it in a way that might be just as sort of propagandized or like just as biased, just as manipulated as anywhere else is. And I think like this is partially because we just generally tend to accept the local narratives. We tend to accept the stories that are perpetuated by our medias, and so we kind of believe in them. Whether or not they're true or false doesn't really matter so much. It's more that we just feel that they're true. We believe in them because they're what's presented to us all the time. And so like they create our worldview, they create our understanding of reality, and they also sort of situate us for making decisions that we will make or that we can make sort of within the framework of where we live. And so we don't necessarily look at things so critically as we do other places, because we kind of just believe in them. We just think that they're reasonable because they're happening in our world, in our context, in our understanding. Another thing too is like when we look at the past, when we can say like in our country or in other countries, we look at the past, like we can say, well, like, oh, they did this for this reason, this reason, this reason, and this was the outcome. And we kind of have like this rationalization that we can use to deconstruct it, to explain why it happened. And maybe that we can accept as like an alternative explanation for why it happened. But we can always like rationalize out like the sort of the manipulation, the propaganda, and say that, well, they only happen in other places. We can sort of convince ourselves that they're not happening where we are, we're in our world, because we don't necessarily know how to look for it, or we can't necessarily be objective about it because we're so wrapped up in our emotional understanding of things. My point here is that like propaganda is always happening. It's always a part of the narrative. It's always part of the stories that we're being told. We're not immune to it, even though we think we are, even though we would say, well, like that doesn't happen here. We're different, we're special, or like all this stuff happens for, totally legitimate reasons. Well, like everyone else thinks that everything is happening there for totally legitimate reasons too. We generally just accept the sort of the narrative of where we live, and we doubt the narrative of other people's because we look at it from the outside. But they're the same as us, right? They think that we're wrong. They think that in their context, their stories make sense and are reasonable and rational. And so like it's like this sort of balance. It's like where we think that there's problems in other places, they probably think those problems exist for us. And so it's hard to like sort of separate ourselves from our bias, from our sort of context, like separate ourselves from the world that we live in and how that is influencing our understanding or how we see things, and how we see things differently from, say, how other people do. And I guess like a question for you is like, are you watching propaganda right now? Like maybe what I'm telling you is propaganda. Like maybe I'm trying to like influence your emotional response to this rather than your rationality. And maybe that's happening, maybe it's not. So let me know in the comments below what you think about propaganda. Was this propaganda? That's another question to answer. If you liked this, if you found it informative or entertaining, click that like button. If you didn't like it, then let me know. Click that dislike button. And if you are curious about making sense of things and you want to sort of try and understand things, but you don't want to be told how to think about them, then click that subscribe button, because that's what I am here to do. You've been watching Making Sense with Robbie. We'll talk next time. Goodbye.